Do you know what the most frightening thing is when a man enters the second half of his career? It's not losing his job. It's not a matter of running out of money. It's the moment he realizes the decision about his departure has already been made. In a room he was never invited into. And then, on what seems like an ordinary morning, he gets called in. No email subject line, no explanation, just one short sentence. Sit down. We need to talk. If you've ever felt yourself slowly becoming invisible, then this story, it's not meant to entertain. It is a reminder that there are moments in life that, if you walk through them in silence, you will lose more than just a job. I am 54 years old. At this age, you no longer measure your career by promotions, but by the number of restructurings you've survived without having your name called. You learn to read between the lines. You learn when to stay quiet. You learn to understand that in the corporate world, there are announcements that are never said out loud. Yet everyone understands them. The email arrived at 9:12 a.m. No subject, no context, no polite greeting. Just a single line, courteous to the point of coldness, as if written by a system accustomed to closing long chapters. Please come to the executive floor. I stared at the screen for a few more seconds, not because I didn't understand, but because I understood all too well. At this age, you don't ask follow-up questions. Questions only make you look like someone who isn't ready to accept what's coming. I stood up from my desk. The chair made a faint sound, small enough to make me realize how long it had been since I last stood up feeling this way. I reached for the blazer hanging behind me, the jacket I only wear when I need to look appropriate, when I need to show that I still belong here. The fabric felt slightly stiff, not new, but clean, respectable enough. That hallway felt longer than usual. Not because it had changed, but because the way I walked through it had. Every step carried an unasked question. Every glass door reflected the image of a man who had spent more than half his life doing everything the right way, now wondering whether the right way was still enough. Strangely, everyone suddenly seemed very busy. Eyes that usually greeted me dropped to their screens. Conversations ended sooner than usual. No one asked where I was going. No one wished me luck. I didn't blame them. In places like this, silence is a survival instinct. Everyone understands that today it's me, but tomorrow it could be them. And no one wants to stand too close to someone who's been called in for a talk. That's when I realized something very clearly. I wasn't afraid of losing money. I wasn't afraid of having to find a new job. What I was afraid of was being erased politely, being wrapped up in a thank you email, being assigned a knowledge transfer role with no authority, being asked to stay just long enough for everything I built to be dismantled, then patted on the shoulder and told, "You did a great job." There is a kind of ending that doesn't hurt immediately, but slowly makes you shrink inside your own memory. The elevator to the top floor moved more slowly than I had hoped. Each passing floor felt like a marker of the years I had spent here. Successful projects, late nights, missed birthdays, missed family dinners, all because of one more important meeting. I used to believe that persistence would be rewarded, that if you were patient enough, loyal enough, the system would protect you. But standing in that elevator that day, I began to understand a different truth. The system doesn't hate you. It just doesn't remember you forever. When the elevator doors opened, I took a deep breath, not to gather courage, but to keep myself from walking into that room with the posture of someone already apologizing for still existing. Because no matter what was about to happen, I knew one thing. There are moments in life that, if you enter them with your back already bent, You will leave them never able to stand straight again. She wasn't standing behind your desk when I walked in. She didn't create distance. She didn't claim a position of power in any performative way. She stood by the window, the morning light slanting across her shoulder, just enough to reveal someone who was accustomed to pressure, but didn't need to use it to weigh others down. The office was so quiet I could clearly hear the steady hum of the air conditioning, the kind of sound that only exists in rooms where important decisions are made. She didn't invite me to sit right away. She looked at me for a few seconds, longer than polite, but not long enough to be scrutinized. That look wasn't searching for fault. It felt more like she was measuring how much truth this room could withstand. Then she gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down," she said calmly. "We need to talk." That sentence, I'd heard it my entire life in many different forms. In marriage, in the family, in meetings that ended the careers of others. It doesn't need to be loud, because its weight lies in one thing. It cannot be taken back. I sat down, placing both hands on the table with my palms open. At this age, even small gestures can be misinterpreted. You learn to slow everything down, to make it more straightforward, as if you're walking on thin ice. She didn't rush. She didn't open her laptop. She didn't shuffle papers. She didn't glance at the clock. She looked straight at me and asked a question I never expected to hear, at least not from someone in her position. "Do you actually want to keep working?" That question wasn't professional. It was human. In that brief moment, all the correct answers I had prepared suddenly felt out of place. I could talk about loyalty, about adaptability, about how much I still had to contribute. I knew exactly which words would make this room feel safe, but I also knew the cost of saying them. At this age, you're no longer afraid of the truth. You're only afraid of lying one more time. I stayed silent for a few seconds, not to create drama, but because I was listening to myself. And for the first time in many years, I realized this wasn't an interview. This was a crossroads. If I answered the way they expected, I would be protected, temporarily. If I answered the way I truly felt, I could lose everything immediately. Finally, I spoke slowly, placing each word on the table as if it had weight. I want to keep working, but in the right way. And when it's time to leave, I don't want to disappear. I want to leave standing upright. There was no sigh, no pity, just a very slight nod. In that moment, I understood the most important thing about this conversation. She wasn't looking for unquestioning loyalty. She was seeking honesty, with the courage not to ask for permission. She slid a sheet of paper toward me, but didn't push it all the way across, almost as if leaving it up to me to decide whether I wanted to touch it or not. "The company is changing," she said, "and there are people who believe experience like yours is a liability." I didn't need to ask who those people were. At this age, you don't pretend to understand what's already apparent. "A list?" I asked. She didn't deny it. "There have been discussions," she replied, "and there have been pressures." I nodded. Not angry, not yet. Just a growing heaviness in my chest, not fear, but a late arriving clarity. I had spent my entire career helping the system run smoothly, and now that very smoothness was preparing to push me out, quietly, logically, and without anyone having to see themselves as cruel. When the door closed behind me at the end of the first part of that conversation, I understood one thing clearly. This was no longer a story about whether I would stay or leave. It was a story about how much I would allow others to define my worth. The door opened without a knock. The sound was slight, but enough to change the temperature of the room. I didn't need to turn around to know that someone had just walked in with the confidence of a person who has never had to ask for permission. The kind of confidence cultivated during years of rapid growth, where results always arrive before the price is paid. He entered as if the room had been waiting for him all along. The suit fit perfectly. The smile was measured, friendly, but it stopped at the corners of his mouth. It never reached his eyes. I knew that look well, the look of someone calculating, not listening. "Everything okay here?" he asked. It sounded like concern, but I understood immediately. It was an inventory. Not what was happening, but who was in the room. Not what the issue was, but what was about to be moved. I recognized it because I had spent a long time on the other side. I had been the one bringing questions like that into meeting rooms, labeling them updates or alignment, when in reality they were territorial markers. I could have stood up right then, thanked them, excused myself, a clean, polite, and safe move. At this age, safety often comes disguised as exits. No one will blame you for taking them. You can call it wisdom, you can call it knowing your place, but deeper than that, it is a quiet agreement to let others decide how you disappear. I looked at the woman sitting across from me. She gave no signal, no warning, no rescue. She just looked at me, not expectant, not urging, as if waiting to see which position I would choose for myself in this moment. And that silence made me understand. This was my choice. I lifted my head and spoke, my voice steady, neither raised nor defiant. "We're not finished." Just one sentence, but enough that it couldn't be taken back. For half a second, very brief, the man's smile faltered. No one else in the room could have noticed, but I did. I've lived long enough to know when a mask slips, even slightly. Then the smile returned. Perfect. Recalibrated with impressive speed. "Of course," he said. "I just wanted to make sure everything is aligned." Aligned. A beautiful word. A harmless word. And a word very often used when someone wants to push you out of the main rhythm. He placed a tablet on the table, skimmed through a few items, then glanced at me again. Not to remember me, but to confirm my position, as if I were a data point that needed to be tagged before moving on. When the door closed behind him, the room fell silent again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was thicker, heavier, carrying the residue of pressure that had just been set down. "That's part of the pressure," the woman said, her voice lower. "Not on you, on me." I nodded. "He wants me gone," I said, not as a question. "He wants a story," she replied. "And that story is, experience is too expensive." My chest tightened, not from fear, but from an anger that had been asleep for a very long time, now waking up. Not explosive, not loud, a cold, apparent, lucid anger. I had once believed my value lay in what I could do, but in that moment, I understood a different truth. At a certain age, people no longer evaluate you by your capabilities. They evaluate you by how easily you can be replaced. "You weren't called up here to be fired," she continued. Then she paused. "But that doesn't mean you're safe." That sentence wasn't comforting. It was honest. And it was that honesty that made me realize this conversation crossed the boundary of work the moment that door opened. This was no longer about who was right or wrong, no longer about keeping or losing a position. It was about a bigger, heavier question. Would I accept being defined as an obstacle, or would I force them to see me as a presence? I sat there in the cold, bright room, and for the first time in many years, I wasn't looking for an exit. I was weighing whether I dared to remain in the very moment that made others uncomfortable. She didn't speak right away. She waited for the room to settle, waited for the residue of the intrusion to fade, as if every serious decision needs a pocket of space untouched by emotion. I noticed that, and for the first time that morning I stopped rushing to guess what was about to happen. "I didn't call you up here to fire you," she said, her voice even, neither reassuring nor evasive. I didn't feel relief. At this age, you learn that sentences beginning with "not" often end with "but," and that's precisely what happened. "But that doesn't mean you're safe." The statement wasn't a threat. It sounded more like a weather report, cold, clear, and with no intention of changing to suit anyone's feelings. She leaned forward for the first time since I'd entered the room, as if to make sure I understood precisely what she was about to say. "Tomorrow morning," she continued, "you'll be part of the board meeting preparation." I nodded. Meeting prep wasn't unusual. I'd been through it countless times. But she wasn't finished. "Not to defend yourself," she said, "not to explain, and certainly not to ask to stay." I looked straight at her, and in that moment, I understood. "You'll be there," she said slowly, "to show them what disappears when people like you leave." The room grew quiet in a different way. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of recognition. A prominent recognition that this wasn't a chance to salvage anything. It was the final wager of dignity. "And if I fail?" I asked. She didn't avoid the question. No detours. "Then you'll leave exactly as you said you wanted to," she replied. Cleanly, honestly, without fading out, without being stretched on until even you begin to doubt your own value. I leaned back in my chair, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of what had just been placed on the table. More than 20 years of work. A house is almost paid off. A grown child watching how I chose to end this chapter, to understand what a decent working life is supposed to look like. The easy choice would have been to stand up right then and there, say thank you, shake hands, leave with the story of enough is enough. Call it wisdom, call it knowing when to stop. But there are moments in life when only a thin layer of disguise separates wisdom and cowardice. She looked at me. No pressure, no demand for a quick answer. Her gaze didn't say she would save me if things went wrong. It said only this: if you walk into that room, you will have to stand on your own legs. "You're asking me to risk everything I've built," I said. "No," she replied. "I'm asking you not to disappear." Her phone lit up on the table, a call from the board. 5 minutes left. She didn't pick it up immediately. She looked at me once more, her voice dropping, not to soften, but to be more truthful. "If we do this wrong, they won't just remove you. They'll turn you into an example." An example of what? Of staying too long? Of not leaving when hinted? Of daring to believe that experience still has a place? I stood up. In that moment, I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel afraid either. I felt something I hadn't felt in this environment for a very long time. Clarity. "All right," I said. "I'm in." When I walked out of the office, the hallway was still quiet. But I understood something I had never understood this clearly before. The greatest danger isn't losing your job. The real danger is letting others, once again, decide whom you are allowed to be in the final stretch of your career. And I had just chosen not to give them that power. The next morning I arrived earlier than usual, not because I was worried about being late, but because at this age, I understand one thing very clearly. There are moments when, if you don't show up first, you get crossed off later. The building was still quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists when all the critical decisions have already been discussed somewhere you weren't invited to. I set my coffee down on the conference table. The faint smell of floor cleaner still lingered in the air, mixed with the scent of new carpet The kind of smell that appears when a space is being refreshed in preparation for a new chapter. I sat there alone, reminding myself of something familiar. Don't think about what you could lose. Think about what's right in front of you. There were 40 minutes left before the prep session began, but she was already there. No jacket. Sleeves rolled up just enough to look neat, not casual. She was writing something on the whiteboard, quick, decisive strokes, as if the thoughts needed to be placed on the surface before hesitation had a chance to intrude. She didn't seem surprised to see me. "You're early," she said, glancing at the clock. "So are you," I replied. She turned back, marker still in hand, and the light from the window fell across her face in a way that made me notice something I hadn't before. Fatigue. Not the kind that comes from lack of sleep, but the kind that comes from holding balance for too long in a system that leans toward convenience rather than correctness. "I won't keep you long," she said. "This isn't a rehearsal, it's alignment." I nodded. In this environment, alignment typically refers to ensuring you understand your role. But this time, I sensed another layer to it. "They won't test your knowledge," she continued. "They'll test your posture." "My posture?" I repeated. "They want to see whether you shrink," she said, "or whether you walk into that room like someone who believes he belongs there." The words hung in the air. Not encouragement, not a promise, just a bare truth about how power works. She handed me a thin packet. No logo, no polished formatting, just numbers, timelines, and a few handwritten notes in the margins. I flipped through the pages. Nothing was new, and that was precisely the point. "When someone tries to corner you," she said, "it helps to know where the real walls actually are." I understood. Experience isn't loud. It doesn't need to perform. It recognizes patterns and waits for the right moment. We stood there for a few seconds without saying a word. The silence didn't make me feel smaller than her, nor did it place her above me. It set us on equal ground, two people about to walk into a room where others like to watch, evaluate, and wait to see who flinches first. "Why me?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. She leaned lightly against the table, arms crossed, thinking. Then she said slowly, "Because you don't confuse urgency with importance, and because someone is underestimating you." I didn't need to ask who. "He thinks I'm outdated." She shook her head. "No, he thinks you're predictable." That difference was enormous. As chairs began to scrape back, as footsteps in the hallway grew more frequent, I took a deep breath. Not to calm myself, but to remind myself that this was not a meeting to ask permission to exist. This was the moment to decide. Would I walk into that room as someone trying to hold on to a position, or as someone who fully understood the value of his presence? And when the conference room door opened, I knew for sure. I hadn't come here to bow my head. The conference room filled up right on time. A long table, its surface cold and glossy, reflected the white lights so sharply that everything looked almost over-polished. Faces I had seen in internal briefings, in quarterly recap videos, were now right in front of me, close enough to notice calculated nods, distant enough that no one had to take responsibility for their own reactions. The questions came quickly, but not loudly. They didn't need volume. They needed permission. How do you see your role changing in the next phase? Can you adapt to the new leadership model? What do you believe is your biggest risk right now? At this age, you hear what lies beneath the questions. They weren't asking about strategy. They were asking, are you willing to apologize for still being here? I answered concisely. No self-promotion, no polishing the past. I spoke about continuity, about moments when change that comes too fast breaks things that haven't yet stabilized. I spoke about people, before systems. And when one of them smiled very slightly, just enough for me to notice, an old instinct stirred. Soften it. Make them comfortable. Don't put anyone in an awkward position. That instinct had saved me many times before. The instinct of someone who understands that careers are sometimes built by making oneself smaller at the right moment. But right there, at that table, I realized this was a point of no return. If I softened it, I would be safe, temporarily. If I spoke plainly, I would be clear and accept the consequences. I chose clarity. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse anyone, I simply placed my value on the table, unwrapped. I said that experience is not meant to delay change, but to know when change breaks more than it fixes. I said that responsibility isn't about running the fastest, but about keeping the people behind you from falling. When I stopped, there was no applause, no conclusion, just a polite ending, the kind that can turn in any direction. Outside the room, the hallway was bright and cold. The woman caught up with me a few steps later. She didn't ask how I felt. She didn't need to. "You didn't bow," she said. "I didn't break," I replied. A very brief smile, then it was gone. We walked a few more steps in silence before she stopped. "There's one more thing," she said. Her voice didn't carry danger, only waiting. "There's a proposal for a transition period. 6 months. You stay, but with reduced authority. Knowledge transfer." I understood immediately. Present enough to neutralize, invisible enough to erase. "And you?" I asked. "I haven't agreed," she said, "but the pressure is real." I looked at her, not as a superior now, but as someone trying to hold a boundary without showing the exhaustion beneath it. The choice was frighteningly clear. Protect myself by stepping back, or remain under scrutiny in case someone might not be able to protect me later. "If that's the path," I said slowly, "I'd rather leave now." She looked at me, unsurprised. "I thought you'd say that." We stood there, no promises, no quiet deals, just clarity, the rarest thing in moments like this. That afternoon, the man passed by my desk. "I hear the prep went well," he said. "For now." I gave a polite smile, the kind that doesn't invite anything further. As I shut down my computer and stood up, a message appeared. "Tomorrow, we'll talk about next steps." No threat, no guarantee. Stepping out into the cold air, I noticed the change in myself. Not relief, not fear, but awareness. This was no longer about holding on to a job, it was about finding a new one. This was about how fully I was willing to be present in the final chapter of my career, and whether quiet respect was enough, or whether I was ready to trade comfort to hold on to myself. The first threat didn't come from a meeting. It came from the inbox, 6:12 a.m. An email written in a tone so perfectly polished that it was impossible to argue with. Soft language, clean structure, and a recipient list longer than necessary, long enough that no one could claim it was accidental. Subject line: Transition plan, ensuring knowledge continuity. I stood in the kitchen, coffee in hand, growing cold, rereading the email for the third time. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I understood it too well. At this age, you're no longer afraid of loud words. What unsettles you are sentences that sound reasonable, even correct, while quietly pulling your footing away, inch by inch. This wasn't about continuity. This was about control. By the time I arrived at the office, the email had already done its work. Smiles lingered a little longer than usual. Conversations ended a little earlier when I approached. No one said anything wrong, but everything shifted half a step. I hadn't been fired, I hadn't been demoted, I hadn't been reassigned. Instead, I had been framed. The experienced one, the one who would support the transition, the one who would stay just long enough for everything to go smoothly. It was the most dangerous position of all, because if you accept it in silence, people will thank you for disappearing the right way. I left the email open on my screen for a few minutes, then closed it. No reply. No reaction. I worked as usual, but with deliberate precision. No defensiveness, no explanations, just competence, the thing rarely mentioned once a different story has already been written for you. By noon, the pressure began to gather behind my eyes like a storm that hadn't broken yet, and I knew I wasn't the only one watching. He appeared in the early afternoon, leaning casually against the divider of my desk as if this were just a harmless conversation between equals. "You saw the transition email, right?" he said. "A wise decision." "Wise for whom?" I asked lightly, as if merely curious. He smiled. "For stability." "Stability," I repeated. "Or predictability?" The smile thinned slightly, not much, but enough for me to know I'd touched something real. "Relevance is always changing," he said, "and this way allows you to exit with dignity." The sentence landed between us, heavier than any threat, because it carried a choice: cooperate and be praised, or resist and become a problem. At this age, problems are rarely forgiven. "I don't currently have plans to leave," I said. He straightened. "Plans can always change." Then he walked away, confident the system would handle the rest. For the first time in weeks, anger broke through restraint. Not explosive, not dramatic. A cold, sharp anger paired with a frightening clarity. If I stayed silent, I would be erased slowly, and thanked for it. I didn't go home right away. I walked along the river, the path I'd taken hundreds of times, always believing tomorrow would look like today. That belief had just collapsed. At this age, you don't get many chances to redefine yourself, and when one appears, it rarely comes with safety. My phone vibrated, a short message. "Can you meet me for a moment?" Not the office, not a conference room, a small cafe, far enough away that no one would accidentally see us. She looked different there, less armored, more tired, but her eyes were still focused. "They're accelerating," she said plainly. "The board likes the plan. It looks very clean." "Clean for them," I replied, "and erases me." She didn't deny it. In that moment, everything became painfully clear. If I fought, I might lose. If she fought with me, she might lose too. And that truth changed the way I saw my choice. "I won't be pushed to the margins," I said. "Not at this stage of my life." She looked at me for a long time, then nodded. "Then we have to change the story," she said. "Not with emotion, with consequences." And in that moment, I understood. This was no longer about holding a role. It was about whether I was willing to become a focal point to keep the right to define myself. And I knew the road ahead would no longer be polite. We didn't promise each other anything. There was no symbolic handshake, no words of encouragement meant to keep morale up. Only a heavy, unspoken understanding hanging between us, that from this moment on, every step would come with a cost. That evening, I opened my laptop and began drafting a resignation letter. Not because I had decided to leave, but because I needed to know I was still capable of leaving. At this age, autonomy is no longer a given. It is a prized possession. It's something you have to remind yourself of quietly, so you don't get pulled along by the inertia of fear. I reread the letter once, then it closed it. Didn't save it. The next morning, I did the opposite of what people expect from someone who is about to be transitioned. I submitted a request for a comprehensive operational review, public, cross-departmental, transparent. No targeting individuals, no assigning blame. A move with only two possible outcomes. Either it would reaffirm my value, or it would paint a clear target on my back. There was no middle ground. When the notice circulated, the atmosphere in the office changed immediately. Not loudly, not explosively, but with a subtle tension, like when everyone senses that something has been triggered, yet no one dares to name it. I caught his gaze from across the floor. No smile, no friendliness, just pure calculation. And in that moment, I knew I had disrupted a familiar rhythm, the rhythm that allows everything to proceed smoothly, without friction. At the end of the day, I received a short message. Be careful tomorrow. If this turns, it will turn very fast. I stood outside in the cold, my breath visible in front of me. For the first time since all this began, fear was no longer the dominant emotion. In its place was something far more dangerous. Determination that had already accepted the consequences. The next morning, the silence arrived before I even sat down at my desk. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that comes from decisions already made somewhere else. Meetings were rescheduled without me. Documents arrived late, missing context. I wasn't removed, but I was placed at a distance, and I understood that was even more frightening. This is the stage where doubt does the work for your opponents. I sat at my desk, hands clasped together, realizing that many men my age choose to end things here. They call it peace. They call it letting go at the right time. But beneath that, it's an acceptance of a story written for them. There were no messages, no glances from across the office. The woman was utterly silent. That absence weighed heavily than any meeting. I began to wonder whether I had misread the situation, whether the earlier alignment had only been a temporary convenience, whether I had placed my trust in someone who didn't have the power to hold it. At noon, Human Resources invited me into a small meeting room. No hostility, no accusations. A brown folder, neatly placed on the table. We just want to understand your intentions, they said. Intentions. As if they were a latent threat. I responded calmly. No defensiveness, no long explanations. My review isn't resistance, I said. It's a responsibility. They took notes, nodded, thanked me. No conclusion. When I walked out, my phone was still silent. For the first time, doubt crept in, not about the company, but about the person I had chosen to stand with. I walked for a long time that evening, letting the buildings thin out, letting the noise fade. At this age, distance helps align your thoughts, and the question emerged more clearly than ever. Am I fighting for what is right? Or simply because I don't know how to stop? The answer didn't come immediately, but I knew one thing. If I stepped back now, I wouldn't just be leaving the company. I would also be leaving my team. I would be leaving myself. The call came late in the afternoon. Not long, not evasive, just enough for me to understand that the earlier silence wasn't abandonment. It was another test. We can't talk for long, she said. Her voice was controlled, but beneath it was a tension I'd never heard before. Meet me after work, not downtown. We met in a small park by the river, far enough that no one from the company would accidentally run into us. Quiet enough that our words didn't need to be whispered. She was already there when I arrived, hands in her coat pockets, watching the water flow steadily, as if searching for answers in a place untouched by power or politics. I should have said something sooner, she began, but timing is critical. I'm being pushed out, I said. No accusation, no anger. The fact so clear that it doesn't require embellishment. She nodded. Yes, if they see us standing together right now, they'll accelerate it. A pause settled between us. Not comfortable, but honest. The earlier silence, the distance, the absence, the lack of response hadn't been hesitation. It was a strategy, a way to slow the process, allowing the system to reveal how far it was willing to go without needing further proof. "They're waiting for you to step back on your own," she continued. "If you do, they won't have to act. Everything will end very neatly." "And if I don't?" I asked. She turned to look at me. This time, she didn't avoid my gaze. "Then they'll escalate. Publicly." That was the first time the price was called by its real name. Staying meant becoming a focal point. Leaving meant confirming the story they had already written. "I won't be humiliated," I said quietly. Not a declaration, a boundary. "I know," she replied. "That's why I'm asking you. If you can hold on a little longer." Hold. Not counterattack, not surrender, just hold. At this age, patience is no longer passive. It's a form of courage very few people recognize, because it requires you to remain still while everything around you tries to push you out of yourself. "I need to know one thing," I said. "If this fails, I'll be walking away alone." She didn't deny it. She didn't reassure me. "Yes." We stood there, two people fully aware of the cost of alignment without guarantees. No promises, no attempts to soften reality. And that was precisely what made this conversation different from all the previous alignments. The following week was the longest of my career. Every meeting felt provisional. Every email felt like it could be the last. The man avoided me altogether. No provocation, no small talk. That avoidance said more than any threat. He didn't need to do anything else. He was waiting for momentum to finish the job. On Friday afternoon, I cleared my desk. Not in despair, but in preparation. If this were to end, it would end cleanly. No signs of panic, no sense that I'd been dragged out. As I shut down my computer, a message appeared on my phone screen. "Monday will change everything. Don't disappear before then." I stepped outside. The city lights came on earlier than usual. The air was cool. For the first time since this began, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what could be lost, and what could be reclaimed if I held my ground. The feeling wasn't hope. Hope is too fragile for this stage of life. It was acceptance. Acceptance of risk. Acceptance of uncertainty. Acceptance that sometimes dignity doesn't come from action, but from standing still when the world wants you to disappear. And as I walked home under the late afternoon lights, I understood that the distance, the silence, the restraint, none of it was the end. They were the space in which a final decision was taking shape. A decision that could close this chapter, or open it in a way none of us could control. But whatever the outcome, I knew one thing for sure. I had not left myself behind on this road. The final decision didn't arrive in a dramatic moment. There was no hard knock on the table, no raised voices, no urgent email sent at midnight. It came on a tranquil Monday morning, the kind of quiet that makes a building feel lighter than usual, as if someone had removed a layer of air from the place. At this age, you understand that real endings are rarely loud. I walked into the meeting room at an unhurried pace, not to make an impression, but to remind myself that I no longer needed to rush to prove anything. I adjusted my jacket not out of confidence, but out of respect for myself, something we often forget after years of trying to please others. The room was packed, not crowded, full, in a deliberate way where every chair was occupied by people who believed their presence carried weight. The numbers were presented. The familiar slides appeared. The language was so smooth that it was almost impossible to argue with. Then came the question everyone was waiting for. But no one wanted to be the first to voice. So how do we move forward? No one looked at me, and that was when I understood. If I stayed silent, that silence would become consent. I stood up, not quickly, not definitely, just enough to remind the room that I was still there. I didn't speak at length. There was no need. I didn't defend myself, nor did I accuse anyone. I spoke about the gaps that numbers don't capture, the risks that never appear on slides, the problems that only reveal themselves when you've lived through enough cycles to recognize repeating patterns. I didn't ask to stay. I didn't ask to be understood. I simply placed the truth on the table, clearly, without wrapping it. The room fell silent. This time the silence wasn't avoidance. It was an acknowledgement. When the meeting ended, there was no applause, no congratulations. But there was also no decision to fade me out. No transition period designed to make me disappear slowly. The story had been rewritten, not in a way where I won, but in a way where I was no longer diminished. I wasn't promoted, I wasn't retained with promises, but I was given back the most important thing of all, the right to choose when I would leave. That evening I walked home. The city was the same as ever, busy, indifferent, unaware of the quiet battles that had just taken place inside a glass-walled room. But inside me, there was a strange sense of lightness. Not relief because everything was fine, but relief because I hadn't traded clarity for comfort. A message arrived later, short, no explanation. Thank you for standing firm today. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Then I typed a single sentence, the only one that felt right. Thank you for letting me do that. There were no long-term plans, no promises about the future, only respect, the kind that doesn't come from titles, but from the choices you make when no one guarantees your protection. If you're still watching at this point, it's probably not because this story is about a company or a position. Maybe it's because somewhere in your life, you're standing in front of a similar moment. A moment where, if you choose silence for the sake of peace, you'll be safe, but smaller. And if you choose to stand upright, you may lose many things, but not yourself. In the second half of life, winning is no longer about moving faster than others. It's about not leaving with your head bowed. If this story made you slow down for a moment, if it made you think about the value of presence or about a decision you've been avoiding, stay with Deep Life Tales. Like, if you believe dignity is always worth protecting. Share, if you know someone who needs to hear this. Comment, if you've ever stood between comfort and clarity. And subscribe, not to follow a channel, but so we don't disappear in silence. Together. Thank you for staying until the very last second.